Hi, everybody. I was sort of thinking what I was going to say here, and I didn't feel very expert because I keep learning new stuff and making new mistakes. So what I thought would be most useful is just to tell you a couple of reflections that I've had on a couple of mistakes and a couple of things that have happened along my last number of years of trying to get grants. And a couple of sort of higher level, I guess, macro thoughts about the value of getting research funding, what kind of academic do you want to be, and so forth. So I've organized it not so much in top 10, but 3 things. So the first is the question of where do you go for money? I think this is an important question because there's going to be a lot of trade-offs in terms of the amount of effort, the degree of competition for a particular opportunity, and this you may want to factor in terms of putting all the effort in. And there's some grants, like the Tri-Council grants, where success rates may be quite low. They're extremely laborious and labor-intensive to put together. I think you should still be trying for them, but what is a kind of a smart thing to do is be trying for a given body of research to be going to several places, including some of these other smaller pockets of money, which might not seem worthwhile, because you have to apply to many of them to cobble together enough funds to do something big. But often the competition rates are lower, the application process is much easier, and so that's, I think, something to bear in mind, to not be thinking solely Tri-Council all the time, but what else is out there that might actually be a good spot to go. I also thought, and I'm stepping back here on more sort of what kind of academic do I want to be kind of question. And I look around at my colleagues and I see many different models of the academic who pursues funding. For example, some academics who have pursued relatively smaller amounts of money but have had a series of short grants for 20 years that have kept them going, them and a couple of students, and have produced amazing work, many books, many things where they were enabled to remain as part of a small team and very close to their work, very close to the thinking about it, to the doing of it, and so forth. Then you have a sort of a middle level kind of approach where you get a bit more distance from your work in that you're running more projects with larger teams and are able to have a bit less of the day-to-day and deep involvement in it, which I've found for my own sort of personality has always kind of been a little bit sad for me because I like to be in it, I like to be deeply involved in it. But I think that whatever you choose, you will find it fluctuates over a career as well. There may be times where you'll start off deeply in it, and then as you get more senior, step out a bit and have more people working. And I guess I should mention the third model is colleagues who've been incredibly successful in getting large bodies of funding and have created sort of very, very productive, large empires doing tons and tons of stuff. So that, is always a question, how deeply can you be involved in the thinking, and also the administration at that point. You need to have people administrating the grants, including people doing the actual work under the grants. So there's many different levels and many different approaches depending upon sort of how you see your contribution and the type of work you want to produce and what role you want to have in it. So that's just may seem like a kind of funny thing to worry about off the bat when you're just trying to get any money. But sort of think about that as you go along, sort of in the process of looking for what types of money, what amounts to get, and what roles you want to play in it. One thing I would also mention is that there used to be from the Tri-Council grants something called the Research Time Stipend or the Research Time Allowance, which was something in essence funds that allowed you to basically buy back some of your teaching time and free that up for research time. Now, neither SSHRC nor CIHR provide that anymore, although some of them have specific salary awards that will allow for that, but the general research awards don't allow for that anymore. This, for an academic with a teaching position, is intensely valuable because it frees up the time that you need to actually do sort of all of the research and the grant getting and the student supervisions and all those sorts of things. So this is another reason why I found it useful to pursue the Tri-Council, but also pursue other kinds of grants that have more flexible funds attached, because I'm able to go and get the research time stipends over here that enable me to then have time to work on across the range of the grants. One other thing which I've come to relatively more recently was paying attention to the opportunities in other countries. So it's not always that as a Canadian academic or researcher that you're allowed to go sort of apply for an NIH grant in the States, for example. But periodically the European Union or others will have programs where not only are you definitely eligible, I was just working on a grant this spring where they said you should be the leader of it because we'll be more competitive because all we ever get is German PIs. We should get a Canadian PI on this European grant. And this was said to be an advantage for this particular application, which I wouldn't have imagined. So keep an eye out to what might be available in these other jurisdictions. And sometimes, in particular the European grants I'm thinking of, it's a requirement that the team be comprised of researchers from at least 3 countries. So this can help in facilitating interesting networks and also open up opportunities for Canadians in these other locations. Okay, so that's just a couple of thoughts about sort of where to go for money and the pros and cons of some of these different locations. If we look at the Tri-Council specifically, and here I'm talking about SSHRC, CIHR, and NSERC, these are excellent grants and excellent sources of funding for researchers here in Canada. The success rates can be quite low, and it can be very, there's a lot of work put into one of these grant applications. So I would say go for them for sure. Make sure that every time you're writing a grant application, you're producing a paper at the same time. That way you are putting all the effort in and you will always get something out of it. Whether you get the grant or not, you've got the paper. I, like my colleagues I suspect, have been turned down many times for these grants, and looking essentially at colleagues who have been successful, it seems to me that perseverance and not taking it personally are the cardinal kind of sort of traits that allow you to be successful in this. It's a matter of keeping going and putting them back in, refining the proposals, and waiting until your number's up. I've sat on the peer review committees of both SSHRC and CIHR over the years. I haven't in the recent CIHR approach, which has changed in recent years. I've been on the peer review committees for the previous sort of way they used to do it. And it's very valuable to see it from the inside. It does help in not taking it personally when you get turned down, because one can see the sort of very weighty role of luck and also of intellectual fashion. So if you have deployed the appropriate buzzwords and the appropriate social problems that have captured the zeitgeist, it has a particular effect. It doesn't always reflect on the quality of the scholarship, on the fundamental quality of the problem. There are these things going on. And on that point of knowing that peer review committees are likely, especially if interdisciplinary, you're going to have people who don't know your discipline, are not going to be aware of what is a novel problem or an innovative approach in your discipline, and are more likely to be trying to attach themselves to some sense of what they think is known as a big problem facing society. I think it's wise, and this is not meant to be sort of cynical or manipulative, but I think it's wise to always try to understand your question at several levels. There's the level at which you are interested in it that speaks to your discipline. There's the level at which it speaks to social problems or social issues that are in fashion that will help to draw in those members of the committee that might wonder why this particular thing matters. I think there's also a tendency in the field, it's sort of an analogous problem to the problem in the sciences of funding basic science versus applied science. People have a sense of what applied science is for and why it's a good investment because they can see the linkage between the work and the solution to some social issue, and the taxpayers are paying for this after all. And so there's always this pressure against the basic science, which is uncertain what it will produce.
To me.
Oh, fair enough. She agrees with me. Sorry. Go basic, she said. So the point I'm trying to make, and you may have discerned my bias already, is that I think there's a tremendous value for the stuff that's not necessarily in fashion. And so I'm always interested in finding ways to convince, to show others the value of it. And so anyway, putting on your in your back of your mind this kind of tension of maintaining true to what you think is a valuable question to be addressed that you can see will get somewhere, but others might not see as directly necessarily. So
2 minutes, Jean.
Okay, one last problem I wanted to mention to you. For anybody who works at the intersection of SSHRC and CIHR, this is a minefield. Even years after this issue came up, it remains a minefield. SSHRC will not fund health research. CIHR only wants to fund stuff that fits within their mandate, which has a clear connection to, for example, improving the health of Canadians or the rest of what's in the mandate. So if you're doing work that sits at the intersection, my SSHRC grant is on the use of biological or somatic therapies for criminal rehabilitation. So if I go in asking, what forms of therapies can we coerce offenders to consent to as a matter of what is cruel and unusual punishment, CIHR is likely to say, that's not what we do. SSHRC is likely to say, wait a minute, you have, as they did to me, they warned me about this, you have doctors, nurses, and scientists on your team. What are they doing there? Take out some of the scientific references out of your reference list, because you're at danger of having people say, this isn't social science, this is treatment of criminals, therapy for criminals. So if you're at the intersection zone, I'd say just quickly, it's wise to talk to your program officers to make sure that you have carefully navigated this to ensure that this is not going to be a problem. So once it gets vetted and is to the peer review panel, then you're okay. But at that initial phase, you want to make sure that you have got it in the right location. And one last super practical point, your method has to be credible. I remember after spending 2 years trying to interview judges and getting a tiny handful of them, someone on a committee, on one of the committees I was on, had set up a whole method which involved interviewing 50 judges across Canada, and I was like, good luck on that, how are you going to do that kind of thing? So careful with the method in terms of it being credible, and extremely clear and economical writing, and if you can possibly manage some white space, I find that packing less really is more in terms of trying to appeal to the reviewer, and so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Jim. Professor Hoffman.
Great, thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. Thanks for the invitation to speak. I have to confess right up front, I feel like a bit of an imposter in the sense that I still feel that sometimes I still feel like I'm quite early in my own career, and any advice I can share with you today is advice that I think Colleen could share even better, in the sense that so much of what I've learned and so much of the success that the Global Strategy Lab has had in raising funds through applications for grants have been because of the advice and mentorship that Colleen and you've offered for many years, so thank you. But I'll do my best, Colleen, and try to give advice based on what I have learned. My first bit of advice, which is maybe, I have identified 10 tips for grant writing, but point number 0 is to get an interest in learning about how grants work. So in a sense, anyone who's here or anyone who's watching the video in the future is already achieving that. So that's great. You're already on the road to getting your first grant or second grant or 10th grant or whichever number of grant. The first tip I would suggest is apply. I have spoken to many colleagues who have talked about grants, then talk more about grants and I think that's the first step, or that's step 0, as I said. But getting there and going and I would suggest just do it, submit it. And even as a first go, if one's never applied for one, just do it. And it goes then with my second point, which is after applying, which is number 1. Number 2 is reapply. And I say that because, as Jen mentioned, funding success rates are at historic lows. And so what that means is, realistically, we have to go into this not expecting success on every time. In fact, I do share with colleagues, I feel like the common element that brings all academics and researchers together is that we constantly face rejection. Whether it's at journals, whether it's at funding agencies, our life is filled with rejection. And I guess the extent to which we have an impact and are happy in our lives is the extent to which we deal with this. And so I think what I do is when I get a rejection, and I get lots of rejections for grants applications, I right away start thinking, okay, I'm going to reapply. How do I reapply? My third tip is, after reapply, is to reapply again. Now, on the second time you throw in a grant application for the same project, what we found, at least at CIHR, is that actually success rates go way up. And so right now, overall, the success rate's around 10% for a grant, which is so 1 in 10 are funded, which is very depressing, I know. But if you're reapplying from previous data when we had reapplications, we found that that success rate went up to around 50% for people who took the effort to respond to peer reviewers or adjust their applications based on the peer review feedback, make those changes, further use the additional time to further strengthen and reapply. It went up in a big way, right? So 50%, that's actually quite a nice number. So but I think if applying after a second rejection, I think you should definitely still reapply, but then maybe it's time to think, okay, is there a different angle I can take? Is there another hot, fashionable issue I can frame my important research on, or is there a way I can tell this through a metaphor or a story, or somehow convey what we're trying to do in a different way, because maybe the initial idea just wasn't working. Now I could go 4, 5, 6, and 7 to be reapply, but I'll stop there. Point number 4 would be, in a grants application, I think it's really important to be bold in your vision. I think it's just marketing 101 that people are more excited about exciting ideas. And so when crafting your grants, you have to think of yourselves a bit as a salesperson, trying to convince those who are reading it, who might be and probably will be unfamiliar with what you're talking about, as well as unfamiliar with the importance of it. You need to be the one to sell them on it and convey why this is part of something really exciting that's going to change the world. Or if it's not going to change the world tomorrow, it'll lead to knowledge that will give us greater insights into our humanity or into society or whatever it is in the future. So be bold in vision, though, which was point number 4, is complemented with point number 5, which is the need to be practical in scope. I think there's a sense of when trying to appeal and sell this bold vision, sometimes, and certainly in my case, we sometimes too often are trying to do too many things in one grants application. And as a result, it means that reviewers are often grappling with not knowing what actually exactly are they going to get out of this research project if it's funded, and are they going to be able to actually tackle the full range of ambitious work that they've proposed. So being practical in scope, I think, is really important. And what that also means is making sure that it feels practical to those who are reviewing it. They can actually see and understand what the research is trying to achieve, whether it's for an applied problem or more theoretical problems. The 6th point is just a very practical one, which is a matter of reading the scoring criteria and actually trying to pitch your grant in relation to that scoring criteria. I've been surprised how many times I get questions in my new role at CIHR asking around, well, I got scored so poorly on this particular aspect, and I'd ask them, well, in the grant application, was it clear how that aspect was going to be addressed? And usually the answer is, well, of course it's clear, but it's implicit, or it's hidden in one paragraph or another, and shouldn't the reviewers have read the masterpiece of a grants application this was, and inferred from its amazingness about how they should be scored highly on that. Now, anyone who's reviewed grants knows it's hundreds of pages that land on your desk, usually while you're marking exams and teaching and have so many other obligations. I think reviewers do take their job seriously and are actually reading what anyone's submitting, but inferring from implied notions hidden in paragraphs, that's probably, we're asking too much of reviewers if we're expecting that of them. So making sure to read the criteria and responding to it, I think, is really important. My point number 7 is that I think grants applications that are successful are those that articulate a theory of impact. Now, it doesn't have to be impact tomorrow or the next day, but having some kind of theory around how this knowledge will contribute to society, whether it's simply better understanding ourselves, understanding the people we used to be, understanding how to solve a policy challenge. Having a theory around how this knowledge contributes, I think, is gives applicants an edge. Number 8, since I'm running out of time, is I think we need to be thinking about articulating how the work is actually going to be done. Now, Jen mentioned at the end the importance of methodology. Certainly at CIHR, it's critically important. I think probably the same at SSHRC and other funders. But I think one thing, especially in the legal field, we often, at least when we're writing articles, we often don't put methods first in the same way that other disciplines do. We do excellent methodologies at this faculty, at this law school. We are filled with exceptional researchers and graduate students. But often we don't explicitly discuss our methods, or it's more implicit as part of our expose. So I think in that sense, in grants applications, making it very explicit, and not just so that we have a very clear method that we're using, but also that the reviewers can actually see in their minds on a day-to-day basis how that method would be implemented. Because it's one thing to say that we're doing, let's say, interviewing 50 judges, as Jen said, that's an interesting method, qualitative method, great. But how are you actually on the day-to-day, how is that actually going to work? And that's where I think Jen's example is exactly the kind of thing that I'm speaking about as well. Number 9, because I'm running out of time, is we have to think increasingly about building teams around research projects. For some kinds of research, you don't need a team, and that's great. And if there is no need for a team, no need to have one on a grants application. But increasingly, I think a lot of our research is going towards more interdisciplinary modalities, at which point reviewers are going to ask, does this investigator have the necessary skills to fully deliver? And maybe if not, based on their credentials or what they can glean from an application, maybe they need to build a team around them. So for me, one of the things that I've struggled with in past applications is that I do a lot of quantitative work, as Colleen mentioned. I don't have a degree that says that I can do stats. Now I've taken 10 graduate level statistics courses, but I don't have a degree, and so often one thing I hear in peer review is that, who's going to do the statistical work? Not. Because I didn't fully explain, I didn't sufficiently explain that I have that background, or alternatively, I didn't bring the team together. So that's key. And my last final point is simply before applying and before spending all the time on bringing together an application, which is so much work, I think the key, you need to make sure that you're eligible for that particular grant and that you meet the relevance criteria. I'm now in this unfortunate position where every time grants come out, I'm always getting these emails from investigators who applied and were deemed either ineligible or that their research was not relevant. And it's really heartbreaking seeing it, and something that I think and these are smart people, right? These are people with PhDs who have faculty positions who I'm having to explain, well, actually they're not a new investigator because they're in the 6th year of their research career, not the 5th year. And the new investigators, only those in the first 5 years. Or this is on population health, and the criteria explicitly excludes healthcare research. So I'm often the one having to share that bad news, and I definitely don't want to share that bad news with anyone in this room. And then the final part of that is also just making sure applications are complete. Recently we've seen sometimes we're missing appendices that are needed, so you just want to make sure that in the rush to submit it in the last, hopefully not the last 60 seconds, as sometimes we've done at my lab, trying to get it in before it's due, just make sure that everything is there and submitted. Otherwise, you won't be able to get to the peer review committee at all. So, thank you very much. Look forward to discussion.
Thank you very much. Great to be here with all my colleagues, and nice to see so many people here. So when Colleen asked us to think about a list of 10 lessons learned, I had to confess that I actually, especially in the age of Facebook, I abhor lists. You know, I was reading on Facebook this morning, 7 reasons why you should date a single mom, 12 ways in which Donald Trump could be impeached, and all these things. So I decided to challenge myself a bit alongside a theme. And that theme to me in all of this is that grant getting is very much about making choices, and often about making tough choices. And so I'm calling my talk the 5 antinomies of research getting, inspired by Kant. I wasn't joking. And so for those who've never had the pleasure of reading Immanuel Kant, an antinomy is a contradiction between 2 beliefs or conclusions that both are themselves reasonable, but together they generate a paradox because it's hard to know which way to go. So I'm going to talk about what I think of as 5 antinomies of grant getting. Antinomies around timing, form, audience, budget, and deliverables, one at a time. Okay, thesis, timing, thesis. There's no time like the present. Antithesis, there's a time for everything. Okay. So no time like the present is a really good motto, and I think Steven said it really well, to prevent that kind of procrastination of just talking about the grant getting for years. And we could probably have a whole 10-minute talk on why people procrastinate for years and years before they throw in an application. I think It's also important as a motto because it's a reminder, and Steven said at this point as well, that if we want to succeed, sometimes we have to try again. But I think it's also important to look at the flip side. Just before I do, I actually wanted to start off with an anecdote that I could call 4 failures and 1 success. And I think everybody should grab hold of the fact that everybody who's spoken so far has talked about their failures. And I think it's our failures that end up, maybe, if we're lucky, driving our success. But when I was a grad student, I see lots of grad students in the room here. In my master's year, I applied for a SHRC and I did not get it. In the first year of my PhD, I applied for a SHRC and I did not get it. In the second year of my PhD, I applied for a SHRC and did not get it. In the third year of my PhD, I applied for a SHRC and did not get it. In the fourth year of my PhD, I applied for a SHRC and did not get it. That caused me some pause when I became a professor. And it turned out I waited 5 years before I applied for a SHRC grant. And I got it. And I was really lucky because I got it the first time. I was also really lucky because it was worth $4 million. There's a lot of failure that one experiences along the way here, and a lot of opportunity to second guess yourself whether this is really what you should be putting your time in. And so I think there's something to what both Professor Chandler and Hoffman talked about before, which is this sense of perseverance and continuing with it, and not allowing other people to define for you your value in all of this. And I'll just continue the anecdote really quickly at the expense of my time to say, having made all of those applications was on the heels of applying to grad school and asking the person I thought was my mentor for a letter of reference for grad school, and him very politely declining, saying he thought I was a good guy, I could maybe be a good teacher, but I probably wasn't cut out for research. So you've got to own your own decisions about this stuff, but sometimes there's no time like the present really helps. At the same time, I think the flip side of that, there's a time for everything. And what I realized in hindsight is, in many ways, I wasn't ready to apply for a big project like that or anything else because I hadn't really worked out what I wanted to do. And the only reason I was applying was because I felt a sense of pressure or obligation. Now, Cynthia and I think Peter would also be glad to hear me say that I think we have a duty as academics to apply for research grants. It's actually a duty. We don't just get to think about whether we ever want to apply for them. The way the structure of universities is, we have to pull our share, and that means applying for grant getting and having, as a collective, a certain amount of success in order for our faculty to succeed. But maybe they'll be less happy to hear me say that I don't think that means you have to apply all the time, or even regularly, or even sooner rather than later. I think in many ways, there is a time for everything, and everything in its time. Sometimes the flip side of that is that timing is everything. And I think that's what happened to me when I finally hit it, when I applied for the first time as a professor. So stick with it, but keep in mind your motives for why you're actually applying. And as a related point that I won't speak much about, I think when you think about timing, you're thinking about motive. And when you're thinking about motive, very often you're thinking about opportunity. And my probably best piece of advice is, in the long run, you can't let opportunity run in your career. There will be many opportunities to chase, but you have to sit down and figure out where your heart is and follow that, rather than chasing every possible opportunity. It leads to a very unfulfilling sort of career. Second antinomy is around form. Thesis, always follow the recipe. Antithesis, one must have a little chaos inside oneself to give birth to a dancing star. Right? A little Nietzsche for you there. So in the past, I have been called the chancer, someone who maybe pushes his luck in a certain kind of way. And I remember, I think it was Cynthia, the very first time that we worked together on a grant application, was quite nervous about the fact that I intended to submit the grant in the font Arial Narrow rather than Times Roman 12. And I was very clear to me that I was going to submit it in Arial Narrow. And it's not because I'm somehow arrogant and have to, or because I'm insecure and think I have to have a font that stands out. It's because I'm verbose and chatty, as you're now finding out. My colleague Michael Geist would never have to use that font because he always can stick within timelines. I always need 3 or 4 more sentences there. Aerial narrow works for me. I've taken my chances with aerial narrow. It's probably a dumb mistake from a form perspective, but it's worked for me through 3 Canada Research Chair applications and a few shirks as well. So form is sometimes important in terms of following the recipe, sometimes less so. There's other aspects where, to me, form is crucial. I have never written a grant application that didn't have a tripartite structure. I don't know if it's because of the Father, the Son, and somebody else, or if it's because of Plato and the horses. But to me, that form is important. But so too is creativity. And here is where I differ from my wife in the kitchen. Erin, for those of you who know her, is very meticulous and would follow the recipe for sure. She would level off the flour in the measuring cup, where I'm sort of a throw it around and whatever. She has consistency every time, which is a great thing and an important thing. And I have lousy meals a lot of the time, but sometimes I have great ones too. So you have to play that balance between following the recipe and sort of going for it. I do think when it comes to research grant getting, though, that even if you are inspired by the sort of creative narrative that I've just given, I don't think the goal is to knock it out of the park. In fact, I think you need to always stay in the park. This is about the inside the park home run. It's a hard thing to do, and it's not always a thing of beauty, but that's, I think, what your goal is. Third antinomy around audience. Thesis, right for your peers. Antithesis, right for the committee. And I'll spend a minute of time on this because I think that the biggest rookie mistake you see out there is for people who only write their grants to the people who are in the same expert peer group as them. And I think that's often a huge mistake, and Steven spoke to this in some ways as well. I think it's a delicate balance for what you're trying to do. And it's definitely true that in at least most grant getting, you get to a stage where they're sending it out to peer review, and you have to pass that stuff. But if it wasn't clear to you from what Steven was saying, it then comes back to a committee, and I think Jen talked to this as well, of experts who aren't necessarily expert in what you do. And if you can't convince them of some narrative hook that brings them in and makes them want to stay with you and makes them want to understand why your project is so important, then you're not going to sort of get there. The fourth antinomy, just because I'm getting the 2-minute warning here, is around budget. Thesis, to each according to their needs. Antithesis, never leave anything on the table. Okay, I think this antinomy is only hard for those like me who never want to leave anything on the table. A lot of people are much more reasonable and not as greedy and just want to put forward what they think is a well-reasoned project that carefully ties the budget to the deliverables and the deliverables to the objectives. That's the key, really. But I think more often than that, if you do that way, more often than not, you'll be leaving things on the table. And Mama also told me not to be uneconomical. And so I think a really well-reasoned project that carefully ties the budget to the deliverables and the deliverables back to the objectives is the first step, and the second step is, and then jack it up some. Now this is controversial advice, some people would disagree. But I think, I'm only sort of half kidding, like it's very important to recognize committees are at their least rational, I found, I don't know if others agree in the room, they're at their least rational when they're evaluating budgets. All of a sudden, they get to the budget stage in a grant that they love, they focus on some aspect of the budget, and that one's out of the running. The flip side, of course, is that they see one that's not a great or exciting grant, but it's got a very well-reasoned budget, so they fund that one. So there's different things. You'll see lousy projects funded because they have a sensible budget and vice versa. I find there's a fair bit of arbitrary budget slashing, at least in the shirk domain, and that's one of the reasons I think, go for it, ask for more, knowing that they may think the part that you thought was most important is the part they're just going to slash, and at least they're giving you money for the other stuff. And once they only fund part of your budget, you have a little more leeway as to which parts of the project you want to carry on anyways. So I don't have time to get into the full details around that, but I'll leave it at that. The last antinomy, which I'll quickly mention and make short points on is around deliverables, which might also be thought of as being around setting expectations. The thesis, promise the moon. The antithesis, under-promise and over-deliver. Actually, for me, this one is not an antinomy. Anyone who knows me knows that I subscribe to the latter motto. I think in grant getting, you never promise the moon. There's a motive to promise the moon, and that is because for most tri-council funding, certainly in the SHRC domain, you never really have to live up to what you produce. You have to do a final report, but there's no deep consequences of promising the moon and then delivering something less than that. So that might be a motive for promising the moon. But I think a better aesthetic and a better way to live life is to set expectations lower and then always overperform on them. People will always be happy with you if you've stated your objectives modestly and then sort of gone over and above them. Yeah, I think I'll stop there and just repeat my last one because it is the motto that I go by. I think when it comes to grant getting, it's really important always under promise and over deliver. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you. And last but not least, Dr. Wilson.
Thanks. I suspect I have the worst track record of anybody who's just spoken on tri-council funding. I think I'm 0 for my last 15. I can't remember the last time I held a tri-council grant. Last competition, there was one actual competition with a 70% acceptance rate and we finished last. I haven't been able to get any funding from PSI, which is an easy way for physicians to get funding. Even in the Department of Medicine internal grants, I can't get funded. But I was the #1 funded research in Department of Medicine last year. But I applied, I tweaked, and I took it personally. But then I just realized this isn't working. And then I realized there's a lot of other places you can get funding. So we got $3.5 million from the Public Health Agency of Canada for our immunization app project, Can Immunize, for those who want to download it, it's a free app, track your vaccines. And we got $1.5 million from the Gates Foundation. And this is only one of 3 Phase 2 Gates Foundation grants ever given to Canada, and in an area that's not my expertise. So I've got 10 pieces of advice. Don't despair if you don't get funding through traditional routes. You may not be funded because the research proposal is not competitive, that's possible, but it's also that it's unique. So I think, if I know this, the more reviewers you have, the less likely of an innovative project being funded. It's just progression to the mean. And I think CIH is increasing the number of reviewers, so just one person to say, I don't like this, and it's not going to get funded. The Gates Foundation actually has a system, a star system, where if one reviewer says, I like this grant, it needs to be funded, it's going to get funded, I don't care what any other reviewer says, it will be funded. And they did that specifically because they recognize that the more reviewers, they're not going to get anything innovative funded. They're going to get a lot of solid research, incremental research, but nothing transformative, and they want to take chances. Number 3, you need to listen to reviewers' comments, and you have to take, there's usually good criticism in there, and you have to be open as you take it personally. But think, my idea is still good. You have to have some confidence and believe, you have to truly believe in what you're doing and look for other sources of funding. And so I think foundations are something that haven't been explored. There are a lot of foundations out there, and they may be prepared to fund your research. But this isn't necessarily like an automatic thing, so I'll just get to that in a second. Just quickly talk about the private sector. So that's an option. Unfortunately, I have to be honest, in academia, that's often not favorably looked upon. It's a conflict of interest. But it's often, it's how research used to get done. It was actually a great partnership between academia, government, and the private sector. In fact, insulin came out of that in Canada, out of Connaught Labs, which is now Sanofi. Some of our greatest discoveries have come from that, but right now we're in an environment where people don't look favorably upon that. Plus, institutions want to take a whole lot of overhead from any private sector funding. OHI takes 50%, and so if you're doing law and policy and stuff, it doesn't make any sense that they take 50% of your funding. It's designed for basic science stuff, but then they're applying it to this stuff, and it doesn't, it's problematic. So going back to the foundation, non-traditional funding, so it's you need to put together a good grant application, but often it's not academics necessarily reviewing this. This is more about building a relationship with people and showing a true commitment to what you're working on. this can take a while. So, if it's a government agency or, if it's a children's advocacy group or something, you need to show you believe in the cause, you've been working for this cause for a while, and you're not just looking for, money because, your idea is fantastic. So, showing commitment to a field is really important. Number 7, the non-traditional, so this is a hard thing for academics. So academics, we're academics, we think they've got great ideas and they should fund me. When you're going to non-traditional funding sources, you're often answering the question they want answered, not the question you want answered. Ideally, you find some alignment, but you need to be prepared to compromise and adjust your view. So the stuff I got from the Gates Foundation is maternal child, preterm birth. It's not related to anything. I'm a general internist. Don't know anything about that stuff really, but it helped fund something else I want to do, which on metabolomics. So I was able to sort of get the funding to answer the question they needed done because we had access to data that other people didn't have, and then also fund my additional research. So ideally you can compromise where you can help answer other people's questions, which is really important, and we have to remember that as academics. These people who are out there, they are the ones who know what questions need to be answered more than we do. And then at the same time you can fund your research. When you're going to these outside agencies, particularly if you're a junior, you need to reduce your risk to the potential funders, right? They like to fund established people so that if it doesn't work out, they can say, well, I funded established people. Like they said, nobody ever got fired for hiring IBM. Even if IBM doesn't deliver, they said, well, who can blame me? So the way to do that, as I mentioned, was create a network of respected experts to support them. You've got a great group here that you can just link with. And then develop a track record of delivering, as mentioned, publish as much as you can. Make it look like, okay, this is a safe and solid investment. Nobody, a bureaucrat could lose their job if they put a lot of money into somebody who then just didn't deliver, and they say, what were you doing funding, taking such a high risk on this person. So when you're looking for opportunities in foundations, look for sectors where there's a lot of buzz, as mentioned, or economic activity. Blood policy, if you're looking for grants, like blood policy is always the transfusion medicine is always looking for research in law and policy. They're always having grants come out. We've tried one in the Bay Area. We actually got the next stage. I didn't bother submitting, sorry. But CBS, Canadian Blood Services, and Alpha, they've had for, I think, 5 years running a competition in blood policy that nobody applied to. So there are these opportunities that they're looking at. That was an MSM issue, and I think they have even more calls for that, how to deal with this issue of MSM and blood transfusions. So that's one area, and technology right now is the other hotbed area. I think Peter Singer got $10 million for ethics and genomics. Like, he's an ethicist, he got funded $10 million from the Gates Foundation to find ethical frameworks around applying genomics. So, that's an example of trying to, you have your area of interest, it can be a conceptual area, but you can apply it and help actually with real issues on the ground. And then finally, let me just sort of take a policy, since we're a health ethics and law group, like the John Kingdon model of the multiple streams. I think you need to think like a policy entrepreneur and look for policy windows. You can have your idea, and it may be a great idea, but it just may not be the time, and you have to wait for those streams to intersect, a window to open up, and then you got to get your grant through and go to the foundation, to the funder. It often could be ideal for a government person, like they've got a problem, like an opioid crisis, and someone has a solution. They've had that solution for a while, and they just need to be able to fund something right now to show that they're actively doing something. And here's someone who's been studying the field for 10 years, never been funded. Okay, let's fund this person. And it's probably a great idea because they've been working on it for 10 years. So you don't despair, stick with your ideas, publish them, work with networks on the ground. You'll iterate your ideas as you work with them because they'll know what the real problems are, and wait for an opportunity to open up.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so we're going to open it up for questions and discussion that could be directed at any of our speakers. Dr. Wilson actually has to go in a few minutes, so perhaps if folks have any particular questions for him, we might start with that. But otherwise, for anybody.
I'll stop. Let's just actually do the last speaker. I think you mentioned at the beginning that going to foundations as opposed to tri-council could have some issues internally, if I've heard you correctly. So I'm just curious, does the university get more out of tri-council money, for example, in terms of what Ontario pays us? Or are there other reasons why sometimes tri-council money may be a better choice or better success for a researcher?
So I mean, more the private sector, each place has their own rules for how much overhead they're going to take. My research institute says 50% from private sector.
It's 40%.
And what do they get from the Tri-Council?
Well, Tri-Council, they directly get 13% overhead from the government, plus the CRC allocations are based on Tri-Council funding, plus the branding associated, plus the Ontario government. So yeah.
So the Gates Foundation is 15%. For Canada, 10% only for the US, interestingly. It's also good, by the way, to go get American funding because the dollar is so much better. It's like a 30% boost in your budget already. And so otherwise they have to negotiate with you. Like, you know, if you're going to government, some government agencies will not give any overhead, but you build it into stuff like rent and personnel like that.
So basically, the government gets a lot more, I think, for the government gives the university essentially a lot more for tri-council funding, which is why there's such pressure from the university for us, for CRC holders, for research chair holders to secure tri-council funding. In fact, you can't be a CRC holder or a university research chair holder unless you're actively in the process of applying for or hold tri-council funding. And I've seen people with extensive private funding and they're like, not good enough, which it seems vaguely ridiculous, but the reason is because of that. Yeah.
This is probably an industry question, but I'm just wondering if you ever try to establish a relationship with the people that you want to submit your proposals to ahead of time. For example, the Gates Foundation, would you have any contact with those people, or I mean, basically, is everything paper? I guess is the question.
So that's a good example. We published a random paper based on our data. It was on how metabolites change by gestational age. And they coincidentally were interested in the opposite. If you had the metabolite, can you predict the gestational age? But the reason they contacted us is Julian Little, who's the former head of the school, the guy at the Gates Foundation knew him. He was actually his mentor. He had that relationship, and he was an author on the paper. And he said, "Oh, I saw you wrote this paper. We're interested in this question." So, again, for the junior people here working with the people around here who probably have those relationships, and your students that are around the world probably now influencing in influential positions, there's an opportunity to leverage those.
But in terms of tri-council, or at least at CIHR, there's no contact in advance. I get lots of emails from Americans who've recently moved to Canada who are applying to CIHR, and they're in the NIH in the US. There is more contact, and you can work with project officers. At CIHR, there is no such thing as a project officer. I think the one thing you can do is find out about eligibility and relevance. You can get that a bit checked in advance, but not anything else. Does it work like that, Chuck?
Although I would say actually it's usually a very good idea to get on the phone. Very good idea to get on the phone to the project officer, the person whose email is on the launch, to check what the criteria are, to check what the relevance is, because the biggest issue I think is that there's a breakdown in communication and you don't truly understand what they're asking for. And the only way to find that out is actually to speak to them. You can send 15 emails and still not know what they actually want. And the only way to get that is to speak to them. And we seem to have become allergic to actually picking up a telephone. We think our job is done and we've sent an email, even if we don't get the right response. And it's just a massive mistake. Phone is my one top tip. Phone. And keep phoning until you find someone who can tell you the answer. Like, what should the budget format be, right? They give you some other kind of advice. It says one thing, and then it turns out they actually wanted it another way, right? And you can't find out unless you actually call. So there's usually somebody there somewhere if you keep digging.
And on that note, I just submitted a small grant application where I contacted, over the course of the preparation, the person in charge about 4 times, discovering that ambiguities in the application material, they had their application material wrong. They're like, oh, we didn't mean that, actually. So it can sometimes be there in black and white and actually not be what they wanted.
Yeah.
If I could just add one point to that as well, and this is sort of for a more narrow situation, but it's also very important to keep in touch with program officers for large team projects and projects that are ongoing. And not just to make sure you're fulfilling the requirements, but more broadly. I think maybe if I were to pick something, a success that I could point to in that respect, I developed such a good relationship with a program officer at Kerr for the large project that I was running that we in fact were able to recruit her to come to law school here, and she's now a law professor, and a law professor who can write Kerr grants like nobody else.
Giles.
Question for Kumanan, but then maybe for other people too. Are there certain U.S. agencies or foundations that are particularly receptive for Canadian applicants? And on the flip side, are there some that are particularly unreceptive for Canadian applicants?
Again, it's a specific, I think NIH is hard now for Canadians to get NIH funding. It has to be something that they can't do in the States, but there are stuff, we have data that they don't have. So there are opportunities there. But then I think the internet, like USAID and those type of ones are very open to anything international. And obviously we found the Gates Foundation, right now they love Canada because of what's going on in the States.
Oh.
Everybody looking very positively upon us right now. So.
That's fair.
So, yes, this way.
I guess for anybody who has insight about the committee process for the Tri-Council, I'm wondering what actual effect the peer reviews have. Sometimes it seems like there's a big disconnect between the peer reviews versus the result at the committee level.
Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so I can speak from, at least from CHR's perspective. So to get to committee, you need to first get through the initial peer review. So applications get triaged. So if they're in the lower, we've just changed it, but I think if it's the lower 60% in terms of scores from the reviewers, you never get to committee. So the committee is only dealing with either applications that had high variance between reviewers or those that were overall scored very well. At which point, the reviewers who, at least one of the reviewers, is supposed to be at the committee and speaking to the application. But it's in a sense a separate process then. It's a more deliberative process, and there's voting that happens at the committee. So you actually have to sort of think of it as one application that has to get through 2 gates. The first gate being the regular peer review where it gets sent out to experts. The second gate being the committee.
But I'm looking for insight, like what would cause something that gets peer reviewed really strongly then not to do well at the committee? If anybody's inside of that, is like the budget issues or?
Could be all of those things, and it's a ranking process. So the committee will be ranking basically projects that have been ranked well by the peer reviewers. So then it becomes a question of how does this very well ranked project by peer reviewers compared to this other very well ranked project by peer reviewers. So it's how they sift it out there, but it can be quite random for reasons.
And the
that
committee
you might fall down.
And those other committee members won't even read that application. They'll be listening to what the other 2 say and somehow come up with how they're going to rank everything without having read all of them.
Yeah, and then the status quo bias is in favor of the peer reviewer scoring that was sent externally. So when the applications come to committee, they're already ranked based on the peer review scores. And the committee then confirms or changes the order. So in that respect, that's how it works.
But I've had ones where we were the top ranked by 4 out of 5 reviewers, and as you said, about 1 reviewer that ranked us low, and so we fell out of actually being fundable by the committee, even although for 4 of the reviewers we were at the top. There's that 1 reviewer, but then we just reapplied. and there we got it.
Just mentioning peer review, it's just in my experience, it's just I applied both in French and English, and the pool of reviewers for me, well, from my experience, seemed very different in French, which is a much smaller pool, and sometimes basically you have peer reviewers who don't have a clue about what you're talking about, versus the pool of reviewers seems to be much larger in the English communities. So basically you have more reviewers that know a bit more about the topic and provide much more relevant commentary, basically. Is that true, or is just my impression?
Yeah, so at least at CIHR it's very true. It's a big challenge that we face. Not only, so Canada overall, we're 35 million people, we're viewed as a small jurisdiction already across Canada. If we then limit ourselves to researchers who are bilingual or francophone, it becomes a much smaller group. And as a result, it's the combination of not enough researchers who report that they're willing to review grants in French, and then the conflicts of interest that come into play among those who, for example, are in Quebec doing work on pharmaceutical policy. You all know each other, and you've all worked with each other. You can't review each other's grants as a result, which then means we would be looking to others you haven't worked with, and someone like you, Mark, you've worked with everyone. So, and we don't yet go international because the challenge with asking non-Canada-based people is that there's the expectation we pay.
It's actually a really good point, and for someone more junior in their career, it's to remember that you don't actually want to work with absolutely everybody, because you need a couple of, if you've made a good connection internationally and somebody likes your work, you don't actually run off and work with them straight away. You think about that, because they may be the peer reviewer, that international peer reviewer that knows you and likes you, who'll write the reference that you need. So that's something to think about as you're going along, as, we tend to want to, like, ooh, wouldn't it be fun to work together? Just think about that a little bit, because will always need a couple of outstanding external international people to be in your back pocket as your peer reviewers that you can trust, that are going to look at it fairly and sort of say, this person is a great person, this is a great project, kind of off to the races, particularly as you start. There are a number of graduate students here in the room. I wonder if any of Jen or Ian, Steven, you have particular comments for graduate students, because I think we've been talking a lot from a faculty perspective and from a graduate student perspective, getting those doctoral fellowships, the Varniers, the big money. How should graduate students think about that?
Well, I will reiterate a point that I hopefully succeeded in making at the beginning of my remarks, which is really not to get too discouraged and not to put yourself in a box that, maybe you're not the sort of person who gets a Vanier or something like that. I mean, people will tell you here, like, there's certain cutoffs for some of these things in terms of how high some of the grades and these kinds of things and previous experience, et cetera, et cetera. So don't get discouraged. But I think another one is, this kind of relates to the last point that you were making, but for graduate, and more appropriately for graduate students, about developing and cultivating relationships, both research relationships and just more generally with the people in the community of potential letter writers for you. You really have to be in a position to get strong letters.
Yeah.
And the best way to do that is to have someone who really knows your work. Yeah. And that doesn't always happen just by virtue of you being one of the better students in a course with them. It often is easier, I have found from personal experience, when there's people who take an interest in the work and then they work with you on that stuff, and then you can write them a glowing letter. I think what many of you might not realize is that most of the people who are on the faculty really want everybody around here to just flourish and shine. And there's certain ways we can help. Letter writing is one of them, and the best letter writing comes from actually having a sense of the person's work and things like that. So developing those kinds of research relationships.
Yeah.
And I think the benefit is that when you're talking about the relationship between a grad student and a professor, you don't get conflicted out in the same way as you do with reviewers in terms of, it's appropriate for somebody who supervised your work to then write a letter about your work, whereas it's not the same for collaborators or co-authors in many contexts.
And I'd endorse everything that Ian said, and also say, and you maybe do this already, but it doesn't hurt to actually just talk to some of your colleagues who have submitted, who've submitted successfully and unsuccessfully, see if they'll share them with you so you can have a look. So, because it can be quite daunting at the outset when you haven't done a bunch of these and you don't know the format and what works and what doesn't and what can you put in there and how do you phrase it, and to look at a couple of models and see what you think of them.
Yeah.
What's really working, what's easy to read, what's hard to read, and sort of gather that advice. And also I'd suggest you could probably ask professors or academics to look at their grant applications too, which might be a little different than what a graduate student is submitting for a doctoral fellowship or something, but it might have some similarities and help sort of show you different ways of doing things.
Yeah, I think that's really important because there's a rhetoric with grant writing, and each council has their own rhetoric. You need to understand the rhetoric. The only way you do that is to actually be exposed to the language and the form, and so the more that you can see other grants, then the more that will help you write your own. So that's really essential. The other thing that I used to be at CIHR for a while as well, and that what we saw was that the Quebec researchers were actually getting much higher rates of grants than others because FRSQ, which is the Quebec Health Research Council, was giving small grants to their researchers to prepare their grant application for CIHR. So they were doing like little mini peer reviews on their own projects before submitting, and so their success rates were like twice as high as the rest of Canada because it's the end of this. And so this goes to the point that the more preliminary work you can do and do it earlier, which is so very hard when you're first starting because you're so scared of just even embarking on this journey. But the more that you can start early and then give it to others to review, give it to your supervisor and others to read it, if you gave it to me, I would tear it apart. And it's merciless. But I only do that because I'd want you to win. It's not until you tear it apart usually and put it back together again that you're going to have anything remotely comprehensible. So my experience, most grants that don't get funded, that are actually good ideas, are badly written. That's numero uno reason why they don't get funded. They're just poorly written. But you think they're wonderful, and you think I have the most amazing thing to say, and how can they not realize my brilliance, my desire to save the world, and all that sort of stuff. And it's so deeply insulting that people don't think you can write. And the reality is most of us can't write very well, even though we think we can. And it's not until you actually sort of embark on that and take it on with humility and start giving it to other people, and they say, well, what did you actually mean by that? So I have someone who I work with, she said, what are you trying to say here, Colleen? And I tell her, and she's like, well, why didn't you say that here then? I'm like, I don't know, because I'm a moron. So just that, it's very difficult to do that, but you have to hand it over. You've got to give it to somebody, and that means you have to start earlier. You've got to be ready to rewrite and rewrite again, because that's a lot easier than applying and applying again. Believe me, a lot easier than applying and applying again is if you rewrite it a few times. So things like the Vanier and those sorts of things, you want to start early and start getting it done. Beg, borrow, steal, other examples of Vaniers or successful SHRC applications and CIHR applications. And so the rhetoric, the kind of way that you have to package this up to be appealing. Sorry, someone's hand.
Can I just reinforce that point by making a bit of a synthesis? I think there's two aspects that come out of what Colleen just said. One is the notion of writing as an iterative process, and the best outcomes from that are getting as many different perspectives of feedback on them and improving those iterations. But I think the only thing that I would say slightly differently is that actually I think many people write very, very well, but there are different genres of writing. And I think Colleen's point here is that the genre of grant writing might be very different from that A+ paper that you nailed in that course that you wrote, which was perfectly written for that course, but doesn't follow the models of success in grant getting. So there's something to understanding or inculcating yourself with the culture of that, and that's where getting hold of all these other ones are and learning. So it's an iterative process that is then iterated within a particular genre of writing.
So, if I may add, it's not just for students, like even for faculty. To ask someone else to read it, like for one of my shock, I asked Cynthia. She arrived in my office, she was like, so, no, don't get it, no. And you have to like get the criticism and just agree with everything.
Yeah.
And I earned it.
So
and
at
I guess that
U of T, we used to do a sort of a formal internal process. You didn't go out the door for a SHRC or a CIHR until you'd gone through an internal vetting mechanism where you got this kind of feedback, which I think is actually really helpful. So formally or informally, you really need to do that in my view to be successful. Yeah.
I have a question regarding to the process of applications. Like, I want to know if you have any advice when you are in the process to make a theoretical problem in a really practical problem. Like this process of narrow a theoretical problem in a practical problem. I would like if you have any advice for that.
Do you want to speak to that?
Well, I think the advice that I give is relatively obvious, but I'll state it anyways in case. I think there are some times where you have a project and it's a theory-based project, and it's not really a practical project. And sometimes to spin it out as though it is actually more of a disadvantage than an advantage. I think the better thing to try and do is to build your projects so that they have a built-in reciprocity, where somehow the theoretical aspect of what you're doing sheds some light on the practical aspect, but the practical aspect also generates certain sort of reconsiderations about theory. And if you can somehow manage it, it's a longer discussion than we could have now about how to actually make that work. But I think the reciprocity is important, rather than just sort of saying, taking your theory project and just making it as though it has all these great practical things. Because people can sniff out when you're just sort of taking something that's topical and saying there's a theory point underlying this, but really the theory question is a theory question. So you have to be really careful about that, I think.
Yeah, on the other hand, as Steven said, that like the peer reviewers come in with a grid. And so, for example, at CIHR, the thing will be relevance to the health of Canadians. So you have to have that, even if it's a stretch. You have to explain, why improving our theory of, whatever it is, will improve or help to improve or somehow speak to the health of Canadians. If you don't have that, you'll get a 0 on that part of the grid, full stop. So there's no monkeying around with this. You really need to read the criteria. You need to read the objectives of the funding organization, and then read the criteria that they will grade you by, because basically with like a 10% success rate or something, they're looking for reasons to kick you off. So they don't have to consider you anymore. That's over there, thank God. That's over there, thank God. That's over there. Now I only have to worry about these 6 because, your mind can only cope with so many kind of variables. So you're eager as a reviewer to have a reason to kick them off, kick you out of the plane. Right, so then I'm down to the 6. So you must do this, even, to the best of your ability, explain why this does speak. It may be, and you can say, look, it's indirect. Indirectly, this is how it will support the health of Canadians. But try as best as you can to explain why your work is important to the objectives of SHRC or CIHR or whoever it is, right? But most people don't actually even read the objectives of the funding organisation before they throw in's not the right word, but before they put in an application. They don't really read the criteria. They don't really read it. They just look at it and then they start writing what they wanted to write. Right? Recipe for failure. You have to read that criteria. You have to match up and make sure you've ticked every box on the way through as you're reviewing it yourself. Because if you don't, you'll get a 0 for that component and you will not be fundable. Yeah.
And I don't think it's that. I don't think it's trumped up or disingenuous to say, here's my theoretical problem and here's the practical policy, real world issues it speaks to. I think that the real problems out there that people are trying to deal with are jam-packed with theory that people are ignoring most of the time. Like even identifying it as a problem and the way they frame it and why it's bad. This is all just packed with theory that's often ignored. And I think it's not difficult, I think, to have the thing that you're interested in, the central problem, which might look theoretical because guess what? It's something that cuts across many problems that are out there. It's up at a higher level, but unpacking it's going to actually speak to all kinds of people with problems that have a family resemblance. So it's sort of what I was sort of saying earlier on, where you try to give the hook to the person to see why it matters what you're doing, and I think you can always find it because the policy practical world is full of theory.
People feeling optimistic or depressed? Optimistic? More optimistic? I think where we were, concerned that often when we have these kinds of discussions, it's a very can sometimes be a very negative sort of discussion because of the limited funding that is out there. I think we heard quite clearly today that to a certain extent the world's your oyster in terms of possibilities for funding. I think as a junior researcher or a graduate student, don't underestimate the power of getting some small grants at first, some very small grants that will get some runs on the board, because that will also, when you go for a slightly bigger grant, you will have already proven your mettle in a sense, and so that really helps. When you go for those bigger grants, you need to hook up with more established researchers that have all the brownie points, who have the research chairs and the publications, because that goes to the impact of that is adjudicated upon, right? So if you go in with one article and a couple of conference presentations, very difficult for you to win one of these grants, these bigger grants. But if you go in and your team includes someone like Steven Hoffman or somebody, Jen Chandler, and you've got you're coming in with their power behind you, the researchers, the peer review committee is going to be much more comfortable with you being the PI on it, because they know you've got kind of trusted mentors working around you, right? So don't underestimate that as well as a more junior person. Very important thing to take on board. The other thing I would say, though, is don't underestimate yourself either. Like too many, particularly women, I find, will wind up being like the people doing all the work and not getting any of the glory. So put your elbows up and ask to be the co-PI or the PI, if it's appropriate, right? So don't assume that you will be down the pecking order necessarily. And they often are wanting these days, particularly the genomics folks and these kinds of folks, they want the ethics and law folks. That's actually a requirement. So just the other day I said to somebody who wanted me on, it turns out the so-called GELS component is the biggest component of the grant. And I'm like, well, you have 4 guys as your co-PI, and it turns out that what we're doing sounds like it's the most important part of the whole grant. So how about I be on there as well? What can they say, really, apart from yes? So don't I think that's quite important to remember as well at a certain point, but networking up and around that. So I wanted to thank our fantastic people who spoke today, Steven Hoffman and Jen Chandler, and Kumanan and Ian, who had to dash off as people want to do, but to thank them very much for a great presentation, and to Peter and Cynthia at the Research Office for all that you guys are doing in supporting us in our research endeavours. We really appreciate it. And to thank you for your engagement and questions, and I'm sure that any and all of us are available for follow-up. This guy you might really want to follow up with because he's really got the keys to the vault these days. Okay, thanks very much.